Hello, Vax Choice and Clout Hub community. Thank you so much for joining us today for a live episode of Know Your Rights. Unfortunately, we're missing Dawn today. She's in the middle of a storm, so she doesn't have internet. But that's not going to stop Chris and our guest from talking about Florida fighting Fauci right now. So I'm excited to hear about it, what they've been doing with their law group. And luckily, Chris is very educated in all this and will be able to break it down.
I don't know about very, but hopefully Rachel and Mimi can break it down for us, but for sure. So yeah, today we've got Rachel Rodriguez and Mimi Miller from Virus Law Group in Florida. And these women have taken on the system. And we all know that everybody's looking for some accountability. Oops, sorry about that. With regard to COVID and all of the countermeasures and the vaccine and just everything surrounding COVID. So Rachel and Mimi have teamed up to fight and try to get some justice and get around the big burden and the big boulder in the middle of the room in all of these cases is the PrEP Act. And so there's been a lot of strategizing with a lot of different lawyers to try to figure out how to get around the PrEP Act with regard to holding some people accountable for the amount of damage that was done through the whole COVID debacle. So with that, I would like to introduce Rachel and Mimi. And hello, good afternoon.
Hello. Good afternoon, Chris. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited to hear what you guys are up to and what your what I want to say. You've got a movement going with regard to trying to get these cases similar to what you filed in Florida in as many different states as possible. Right. So I guess with that introduction, what exactly do you all have going on, and how have you structured this with regard to the fight?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I feel like it's full circle because I don't even remember, but I was on with you and Dawn some time ago. I think we were talking about some other litigation, but it was in the full swing of the so-called pandemic. And I'm honored to be fighting with you guys. You guys have been in it from the very beginning. And so thank you for all the hard work you've been doing. It's been immeasurable for your clients and for so many injured people in this country. What we're going to go over today, I think, so just to clarify for the audience, these are not cases specifically, because what we've done, and to reference your comment about the PrEP Act, what we've done is I saw back in 2021, I had a lot of calls coming into my office with regard to victims from hospitals. And I say victims because it became very clear when we looked at the evidence that people were not dying in the hospital as a result of COVID. They were dying in the hospital because of malpractice. And we believe it's beyond malpractice, that there is intent and causation there sufficient for criminal culpability. And when I was looking at these matters, I did consult very experienced medical malpractice attorneys in Florida with regard to cases that were coming to my office. And that's not my area of loss, but there was nobody else doing it, as you know, in the last few years. There's been very few who have even attempted. And so I wanted to look into it carefully. And unfortunately, here in Florida, it became abundantly clear very quickly that there was no avenue for civil remedy here. The law on medical malpractice in Florida is pretty restricted. And in addition, during COVID, the legislature, it's one of those things, actually enacted further protections for those who are engaged in bad acting under COVID. So beyond the PrEP Act, there was the statute of limitations. For example, the law limited or lessened the statute of limitations for bringing a medical malpractice claim regarding COVID matters to 1 year, as opposed to the general state statute of limitations of 2 years. So not only did you have to get around the question of whether this was on the basis of covered countermeasures, which has been interpreted by courts to mean virtually everything, even where that's not appropriate.
Right.
But also grieving family members had to have all their records together and have a report from a doctor within 1 year. It was not going to happen here. And so I pivoted and I said, well, this looks criminal to me. I think we can do this. How do we get it done? And so that started a process of talking with other lawyers. Again, criminal procedure, criminal prosecution, and defense not being something that I've customarily done. We launched out into that and thought, how do we address this from a state criminal code position? We knew that we would not be able to get the federal government to police itself. You can cite to all the evidence there that the federal government is in on the action, and are in fact individual policymakers, both current and prior, that we name in our brief, in our petition. And so this had to be a state authority, a state jurisdiction project. And so that's sort of the broad overview. And then in 2023, Mimi and I met, and she does have prosecutorial experience. And so she jumped on board with absolute gusto. And our first brief, so what we've done is it's a petition submitted by victims that are constituents of that state to their law enforcement through the correct criminal procedure, and saying, please, there's been a murder, there's been injury. We want you to investigate, and if probable cause is found for prosecution, we want you to prosecute. They present their information. They give the information of their loved one who passed away. The first time we didn't have any survivors in Florida. Now we do. When we have now just refiled to the new AG Uthmeyer, we have 4 individuals who survived the protocols in Florida who are part of the petitioner group. And so from there, the brief itself, basically we've packaged evidence that's publicly available. We have presented stories of the individual victims from the point of view of their families or the survivors. And we have given them a list. We say, look, we believe the evidence demonstrates that these code sections have been violated. We believe that your investigation will find at a minimum that there's probable cause for indictment and prosecution under these code sections. And that's the general structure that we've done state to state. Again, the first state was in late 2023. That was Florida. Then we moved on and filed similar process in Texas, Louisiana, Missouri, Oklahoma, now Arizona, and also Pennsylvania. And now we've just done our first sort of resubmission with a significant update. There was a lot more information to include, and more than double the petitioners in Florida. We started out with 32. We now have 75 and counting. So we represent, we're not specifically representing as counsel, but we are advocating on behalf of more than 200 victims in 7 states at this time.
Wow. So yes, that's, and I can't even imagine what that number is going to grow to by the time this is over, because it's just the stories that I heard, and it's really difficult to not say that this was a blatant, that it's more than just negligence, more than just malpractice. We would get calls and it was the same story, no matter what state, no matter what hospital, no matter what. I mean, they would start talking, and in some cases I said, let me tell you what I think you're going to say. And they're like, basically, and it was, and that just shows somebody's pulling the puppet strings, right? I mean, that's exactly right. Consistent across the country. We've had other similar types of situations like that have shown up, and I'm like, okay, obviously this is the new agenda, because we're hearing the same story. Nursing students, all of the hospitals started going after nursing students, clinicals. They wouldn't, they won't give them a medical exemption or a vaccine exemption. they know they can't hit their permanent folks, so they hit the people that are going to be there for 4 weeks, right? So I mean, it's just, and all of a sudden we had all these inquisitions about that, and I was like, okay, that's obviously the new thing going on.
Yeah.
So it's just amazing when you see the what looks like coordination, and obviously a very common message that's coming down from somewhere. So Mimi, you do have a criminal prosecution background. So tell us how you got involved in your interest in this. And I think you said you met in 2023.
Yeah. Thank you. And I just repeated what Rachel said. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here and to be talking with you guys. You do incredible work. Yes. So I worked as a county prosecutor for a time, and was aware of a lot of the COVID problems and a lot of the COVID issues because of my family. My dad was one of the doctor who stood up against things out in Washington State. And so I've kind of been behind the scenes, at least on an individual level for since the beginning. But I hadn't really had an opportunity to be part of this work until 23. And Rachel and I met in, I think was it Atlanta at the Freedom Council conference?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we met and started talking, talked a little bit about the criminal stuff. I think there were some other cases as well that I was going to kind of help out on that I initially started on. And then we just kind of talked through the process, and then putting these together, like Rachel said, it was all open source. Everything is publicly available online. A lot of it comes from FOIA documents, just going through, those hundreds of pages of like emails and text messages, because they say a lot of things in those messages. You just have to take the time to go through them. There's like you said, there's incredible whistleblowers that have come out talking about what's happened, all sorts of things. And so, one of the things that we did is when we started this, and partially this is because I was a prosecutor, and so this is how you do it, is you start with your victim. You find out the story, you figure out what happened, and then you go from there. You follow up. Okay, they talked about this. What happened there? And so we started with our victims. We started with the people that had suffered. We read their stories. We understood their stories. And then we went to the law, to the publicly available evidence, and figured out, okay, what fits what these people have suffered.
Right.
And one of the things about our petitions as well is it doesn't just include the federal people like Fauci and Birx and Collins and Walensky and all of them, but it also includes the hospital administrators of the hospitals where these people suffered and died, because they were absolutely a part of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Whenever
without the administrators, there would have been no money exchanging hands.
Right.
There wouldn't have been the pressure. If the administrators had stood up to the pressure they were receiving from the federal side and had denied the money. I mean, and we can talk a little bit more about this because that put the entire hospital at risk. There was severe perverse incentives, but they're culpable because they enforced it and took the money. And you can see that everywhere around the country.
Right. Yeah. What did we figure out? There was like a $500,000 bounty on all of our heads on this whole thing. By the time you were done with what the hospitals were paid for the COVID diagnosis, the ventilator, the remdesivir, the death, it was criminal. You're just like, how is this not, murder for hire? I just don't even,
exactly.
Seriously.
Exactly. Yeah. Murder for hire sounds, it's not salacious to say that. It's not hyperbolic when you look at the evidence.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So you've filed in about 8 states now? 9?
7. 7 states. And we've got more on deck. We're working on, dare I say, which states. We've got at least 3 that we're actively looking at. My office has received requests. So we've teamed up we've collaborated with former Feds group, Freedom Foundation, because they started this way back in the beginning as well. In fact, I spoke with Brad Geyer early on in 2021. And then at the very beginning of 2022 is when we were talking about what are the next steps? How do we move this forward? And their group was already looking at, this is going to be Nuremberg. What's going on is serious. And so they were collecting the stories from victims right up front, and also have been doing a lot of work in counseling victims and building those networks. And so there are other groups around the country that we're also collaborating with who have, on a state basis, usually have connected. They're also providing counseling and fellowship and other very logistical provisions for people who have lost everything when their loved one passed away.
Right.
But Former Feds has the most extensive database, I would say, that I'm aware of with regard to all these individuals. And so they've been really helpful for us when we get a call to then reach out to them and say, okay, are there others who have already come forward and would be interested in being petitioners on what we're doing?
Okay.
And so aside from their office, though, my office, independently of that database, and there might be some overlap, but we've gotten calls from victims in 37 states asking us to help them in their state. That's how extensive this is. We do know that it's all over the country because it was a federally pressed and incentivized set of crimes. It was a COVID criminal enterprise, is what I call it. I think it began before the COVID era, but yeah, we know that we'd love to do this in every single state. But you know, we've got to kind of go one by one and address things depending on whether these have to be sent directly to the county prosecutors first, according to procedure, or to the AG. We try to also make sure that we're working on the ground with people in that state who have the relationships, so that these petitions are given the best attention possible by those who can do something about it, because we're very serious about this. We think that there should be investigations everywhere. Yeah.
So, Mimi, you started talking about, you know, looking at the victim first and then looking at the law and, you know, matching where there might be violations. What does it look like if somebody's in a state, if they're listening to this, they're in a state and they're like, hey, you know, here, what makes a state ripe for getting to the point where you file the petition? What else? Is there anybody else? Oh, hang on, I got a jet flying by. Get to the point where you say, okay, we're ripe to file in that state. So is there other folks besides Rachel just mentioned about the people on the ground? You've got to have, you know, connections. What's a good state look like with regard to those kinds of things? What does that look like?
Well, so I would say ideally, we do like to have a community on the ground. We like to have people who know each other, who've been talking, who have shared stories. If possible, we like to have an attorney or two that are on the ground, that are willing to kind of be present for things, you know, be present for meetings if we're not able to fly out there. You know, but you talk about ripeness. You know, every single person that suffered this is a victim. And that means that their state law enforcement, it's their job to investigate what happened to them. And so really, I would say all you actually need is one victim who's willing to speak up and say, this is what happened to me, or this is what happened to my loved one. Okay. Because, you know, we don't need 50 people to stand up and say it for it to matter. It matters that it happened to one.
Right.
So.
And then the petition goes through law enforcement, and then that's where you were saying, Rachel, maybe whether it goes to the county, does it go through the state AG? What's the process on the ground?
So that depends by state. Every state has a slightly different process. Some states, you're able to send a petition straight to the Attorney General, and they're able to have independent authority to begin an investigation.
Okay.
Other states, like Texas is one example, the Attorney General in Texas does not have that authority. He must have a criminal case referred to him by a county district attorney. And so in states like Texas, or I think Louisiana is another one, we've petitioned all of the county district attorneys where we've had victims reach out to us and submit it and say, hey, you can investigate this. You should also probably refer this so it can be statewide, and you can pull in other resources to help your investigation. Okay. That's typically how it goes. But usually we go through the elected official's office, so either the elected district attorney or the elected attorney general, rather than like your local police department.
Okay. There are other states too where the legislators have an opportunity to open their own criminal investigation. And we don't typically look at that unless those legislators reach out to us. And often that's been through people that are already on the ground pursuing these things, and then they're already engaged with their representatives and their senators. Even governors' offices have been involved in these things within the 7 states that we're working in. So if that's the case, we also provide them some of those tools and say, well, you know, we'll even reassess sort of the way that the petition is framed. And then we'll provide that to them. We'll, you know, we just want to help anybody on the ground who has a will to see this through. There's also most of the states also have their own sort of Bureau of Investigation, sort of like the FBI, they have it at the state level. And that organization, that agency also has jurisdiction to open investigations. But again, you know, how that happens, it depends if there's a will in one agency, but there's not, you know, on the part of the prosecutors. So we try to keep an eye open for any opportunity, and then we encourage people to pursue even contacting those offices and providing that political cover and pressure in order to see something move forward.
Right. So let's go back to Florida. That's obviously your oldest. I'm saying your oldest case. That was the first place that you filed the petition. What have you encountered? Who wants to play? Who doesn't? I know you've got a Surgeon General there that certainly has been on the right side of all of the COVID stuff. So, are you finding any support there? Tell us what's happening in Florida.
Well, I think Florida is a very interesting case because we have had a lot of freedoms that were not afforded in other states, and so we're really grateful for that. There's been a lot more ability to kind of move and advocate, but you know, not everything is you know, all right in paradise, if you will, and also these issues, you know, that you have to take into consideration a lot of the political forces that are at play that we may not see. And so I don't know. I don't know what the initiatives are. I don't know what all of the concerns might be across the board. But I do know that when AG Uthmeyer came in, he and Governor DeSantis were discussing how they wanted to renew their commitment to address the abuses. And so on that basis, we've represented. That's precisely why we went ahead and resubmitted. And we said, look, we're really excited about your initiatives. And here's something really, really important to the people of Florida. And we'd really like you to take a look at this. So we haven't heard back from them as yet, but we're hopeful that we're going to see some movement in Florida.
Okay. And in Florida, did you have to go through the county first, or could you go straight to the AG? And what's the process there in Florida?
Here in Florida, the AG does have the original jurisdiction to take it on at a statewide level.
Okay. And Mimi, are you in Florida as well?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So what are you all doing to get the word out? I mean, I know we're happy here today to hopefully get the word out further, but what are sort of your public relations look like with regard to getting the message out, and who are you targeting, and in terms of getting the information about this?
Well, we're very open and very grateful to anyone, including yourself, you know, and your show, for allowing us an opportunity to talk on behalf of the victims that have come to us and that we've assisted in these petitions. So it's fairly organic, and I'm really pleased that with regard to our more recent submissions in Arizona and Pennsylvania, there was quite a bit of online activity. So we got picked up by Vigilant Fox, and then from there we were able to go on InfoWars, which was a really, really great opportunity for a much broader audience to hear that this is happening. And one of the more encouraging things that I think I've seen in the last few weeks is how people have contacted us and said, wow, I'm just really grateful to see that there's another avenue that's being pursued that they hadn't known about before. We've obviously been working at this for several years, but it just hadn't reached as wide of an audience. So that's really encouraging to me. I want people in this fight, especially people who have been telling their story and have been vigilant and have had courage throughout this whole process, telling their story and seeking justice. I'm really glad to have an opportunity to invigorate them with what we're doing. And to that end, I want to make sure that everybody knows that as of right now, there are 2 open county level investigations on the basis of the evidence that we've presented. So I think that's extraordinary, and I'm very grateful to those prosecutors. And we hope to see many, many more.
That's really exciting. You know, it's one of those things where you just hope that once the dam gets poked through, right, and that stream starts out, that there's no stopping it, right? I mean, because we know that this was so prevalent and so evil, the agenda was so evil. And so with regard to the PrEP Act, going back to the PrEP Act and the fact that seems to thwart every effort on anybody to try to get any kind of justice with regard to what was done to them with any countermeasure. You know, we know it's not just the vaccine, but the remdesivir and everything else that happened to folks in that regard. Is there efforts, or is there hope at the state level to get, I mean, we know the PrEP Act is a federal law, right? And I don't know if you guys have had discussions with, I know we have, with regard to, can we get past the PrEP Act with a state action? Is that what you're ultimately hoping to be able to do?
Well, I'll let Mimi take some of this, because she may have more from her study on this with regard to some of the efforts literally to nullify from the state level. But just one point about this project in particular, because it's seeking criminal investigation and prosecution, the PrEP Act doesn't even apply. So we're not even sidestepping PrEP. We're doing something that it doesn't even touch. And the hope is obviously that getting prosecutions demonstrates that it was criminal, which then opens up the civil. It weakens PrEP on the one hand, but on the other hand, it demonstrates that the part of that PrEP doesn't reach, which is the what is the term? Maybe it's willful. What is it?
Willful misconduct, I think.
Willful misconduct. Right. So that's this sort of the civil way of saying, you know, you meant to. So if we get to criminal, right, which is further down on the spectrum, then we can get to the willful misconduct. And so that's part of what we're doing. It's a complementary, I see it as a complementary initiative to a lot of what people have been really working hard at the civil side.
Right. Yeah, because I don't think we've had a definition yet by the courts in terms of where that line is. Where is that line of willful, misconduct? And it's this is going to be.
I don't think they're even touching it. I mean, I wouldn't say that I've carefully studied all of the cases where the dismissals have come down, but my brief overview is that basically the courts are ignoring it entirely. It's like, if it says COVID something, that's PrEP. And so there's not been a good enough analysis of where willful misconduct comes into play. And the other problem you see is you have to get the court to understand that there is misconduct. They're not understanding that. And you can see that, and you know, the bench is made up of people as well. So if all of the society was under what I call the COVID delusion, because at this point the evidence demonstrates it wasn't as advertised. If they're still trying to wrestle with that, then I could see where they're coming from. Also, I've had one opportunity now. It's the first time I've heard from a hospital administrative staff, like the administrator's chief medical officer and the assistant chief medical officer and others in and legal counsel to the hospital. And that particular hospital, and I think you would hear this parroted all over the country, they're hanging everything on the defensive narrative that it was such an unprecedented time we did the best we could.
Mhm.
I also heard it was reasonable to do X, which X in this particular patient's case was not to treat an active catastrophic cardiac event, because other people in the area, other hospitals also thought that was reasonable. Never mind what the individual patient needed, right? Everybody thought so. Everybody was scared. We did the best we could. We're so sorry it was a tragedy. Yeah. This is what's coming. So you've got to, that's what all the hospitals are saying in conjunction. Right. And we have to get a court to see it as misconduct. And not only misconduct, it has to be more than negligent. It has to be willful. This, I can see why it's difficult to get the courts to look at that. They should, especially at a dismissal stage, right? There should be a review. If it has been properly pled in the complaint, then the court should see it through and go to discovery to see if, as a, I don't know if it's a jurisdictional issue at this point. But then to be able to see, maybe there needs to be some limited discovery on the question of, can we, is there sufficient evidence to see that there is a possibility to get past PrEP? I think the cases that have or I should say, continue to process the case, notwithstanding PrEP. I think there have been some successful cases on state law grounds or demonstrating very clearly ahead of time that the issue complained of, the injury comes from, the causation is from misconduct that is not a countermeasure. But then obviously that's not PrEP either. But those, even those cases have been extremely difficult to get to. So, basically the civil litigation on this is an absolute 90-degree angle. And it's been very difficult for any practitioner to get past it.
And I can, to some degree, see what you're saying as far as having the courts get there. But on the other hand, prior to COVID, when did you ever diagnose a patient with groupthink, with hive mind? Right?
Never.
I mean, that is negligent. I mean, you don't, oh, geez, everybody's doing it, so let's treat them that. I mean, what happened to treating the patient in front of you? I mean, this is just
you would think it's malpractice per se. There is no such thing. But I mean, it almost seems like it, right? It's like you actually didn't practice medicine is the problem we're complaining of. It's malpractice because it's non-practice.
Right.
You know, that's almost, well, maybe we should try that theory in court.
Yeah. So Mimi, what has been your research and your thoughts on this whole thing?
So I haven't spent that much time researching PrEP. Because like we kind of mentioned at the beginning, my area of focus has really been more the criminal side. That was my background. That's still kind of most of what I know. I will say when we get to stuff about like willful misconduct, when we're talking about like the knowledge of hospital administrators, the knowledge of practitioners, it's okay because everyone else was doing it. It's such an offensive thing to me because, we have like some whistleblowers where, there's a doctor who had a patient who was like a girl in her young 20s, no medical problems at all, except that she was in like a car crash or something like that, but she tested positive for COVID. So one of the few people who's actually a candidate for remdesivir, the way it was presented. So he went and talked to infectious disease and like the head of infectious disease or one of them. I was like, hey, I've got this patient. It was right when remdesivir was rolled out. They hadn't really been giving it to anyone. The infectious disease guy looked at the patient, looked at the chart. He's like, she seems like a nice girl. Don't give her remdesivir.
Oh my goodness.
And so this myth that, well, we didn't know any better. This myth that, well, we didn't know remdesivir was going to hurt people. We didn't know that like 9 out of 10 people we put on a ventilator are going to die. And then we're going to get $40,000 if we keep them alive for 72 hours on a vent. It's ridiculous. And so I think that, when we're given an opportunity, when we see people, when we see prosecutors in particular, attorney generals choose to be courageous and to say, no, I'm going to stand up for the people that I've sworn an oath to stand up for. I'm going to investigate this. I'm going to take this seriously. I'm going to do something about this. When we see these stories told, when we see the truth of the evidence, I think it's going to punch a hole through PrEP. Absolutely. Right. And I know there's some great efforts as well around to get PrEP either repealed or amended. I think those are fantastic efforts as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a monstrosity. The PrEP Act itself, in my opinion, is completely unconstitutional. But what was I going to say? Had a question had to do with tagging on to what you were saying.
The non-practice versus malpractice.
With regard to the criminal, I remembered. So with regard to the criminal, you are the petition is targeting federal and local, state, whoever's in that chain of decision making, right, or influence. Are you dealing at all, or are you going at this from a criminal like RICO kind of?
So
yes, go ahead, Mimi. Let's discuss what the actual. We've gone 35 minutes and we haven't talked about the actual claims that we see, and there's a pattern across the state. So go ahead.
Yeah.
So in the states that have a state RICO, yes.
Okay.
Not every state has a state RICO.
Okay.
Many of them do. When we're looking at it, if you want, I can just outline like a couple of the crimes that are pretty standard. The first one would be committing acts of terrorism or murder while committing acts of terrorism. That's something, I think it's only maybe 11 states have a state terrorism statute. And of those, most of them actually don't involve just, buildings and airplanes exploding and things like that. It's really more focused on a violent offense, something that harms and kills people. And it's done in a way like to terrorize. It's part of this, the intent there is to manipulate, to coerce, to intimidate the civilian population, or to manipulate and coerce government policy, things like that. So terrorism is one that we've seen in a lot of states. As I said, murder, RICO, we've talked about a little bit. Things like manslaughter, which is more of a reckless murder, human trafficking for labor services. And that's really, if you think kind of along the lines of like forced organ harvesting, that type of labor and services trafficking, where you're taking someone, you're misusing the medical health system, you're abusing them, isolating them, you're not allowing them to see their family, you're providing them things against their consent to make you money.
Right.
And then you also have kind of standard like abuse, aggravated abuse, and in many cases as well, abuse of the elderly or disabled, vulnerable populations.
Right. What about battery? I mean, are you looking at like medical battery?
Yeah.
We've included, so one of the things that's very critical, and it seems logistical, but it's important on the strategy side, is we're trying to keep the briefs as succinct as possible.
Brief. You're trying to keep the brief.
There is so much more.
Yeah.
In fact, in one of the counties where the investigation was opened, we were requested, on the basis of the initial brief, we were requested to present an actual criminal complaint. That's what they called it. And essentially, we had to answer a certain set number of questions. It was their standard form for how they open investigation in that county. And so it was several questions, and we specified the particular victims from that county. As we were doing it, more came. It turns out those hospitals, there was some history there. We presented more specific names out of the hospitals. We put a lot more in. So obviously, for every single one of these, we could. And I don't remember, Mimi. It was quite a few pages. So there's a lot more that we could put in here, and we try to keep it brief. So we've often put footnotes to say this is sort of the pattern of conduct, but within that also consider medical battery, some other more unique state statutes that may not be in another state but are there. Mimi mentioned vulnerable populations. There is one state in particular where there's specific crimes against, I should say specific criminal culpability for caretakers against their charges when they conduct, they abuse or engage in misconduct towards those that are under their care. So there's some leeway there. And of course, we also point out that we are simply suggesting perhaps a starting place for these things, and we hope that they'll take the investigation and go further with it.
So one of the things that we saw with regard to, in a lot of these cases, with regard to, again, I think the evidence that it was a willful, coordinated kind of effort, and with regard to, I think, trying to hide some of the culpability or just hide what they were doing, was this traveling nurses. Did you guys, in those particular, a lot of those situations where you didn't have any continuity from like one day to the next, so trying to put these pieces together for the families that were trying to put the pieces together was really difficult. But to me, that was just evidence that that was a deliberate thing, that they were trying to make it difficult to track this, and to say, one, for those nurses didn't know from one day to the next. You had a new nurse, she didn't know what happened the night before, right? So you've got this disconnect with regard to the care, and making it very, very difficult for people to try to figure out exactly what had happened and who would be responsible for that. Did you hear some of that, and does that sort of fit into this somehow? Because to me, it was a very, very blatant thing to me that showed this wasn't done by accident. There was some thought into how are we gonna do this, right? And how are we gonna make it, so it is as difficult as possible, or that nobody can really figure out and put the puzzle pieces together.
So I would say, I think that's absolutely correct. I think it actually goes beyond. I think it's actually worse than just that. Okay. So in kind of stepping back to your initial question, in the petitions, we don't go in depth into that point, partially because I think when an investigation is begun, they'll look at the individual medical records and they'll start seeing, wait a minute, they're getting different nurses every day. That's not normal. Right. And I think that'll be part of the natural investigation process. So in relating to like traveling nurses and things like that, we know that they used the violations of medical ethics, the vaccine mandates, a whole lot of tactics to get out as many nurses and doctors that were willing to actually provide good patient care as they could, as fast as possible. The travelers and the people that came in, a lot of that was actually done through FEMA and USAID funding.
Oh, interesting.
And so if you look, there's a lot of contracts to the hospitals through FEMA and USAID. So hospitals were not only bringing in these travelers who are getting paid a whole lot of money, but the hospitals were then reimbursed by the federal government for the entire cost of what they were paid by the hospital. And so it's actually, not only did they stop paying their staff because they got them fired and kicked out and lost their livelihood for saying, well, I have a medical exemption for this vaccine, or I have a religious exemption for this vaccine, or why can't I tell my patient about ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine that I see working?
Right.
But not only did they fire them and end their careers, but then they got paid by the federal government to bring in other people to then deliver this. I can't even call it healthcare, this atrocity, this scheme, this pattern.
Right.
And I want to piggyback on that, because when we were talking about the specific charges, I wanted to point out something about the terrorism charge. Again, none of these are salacious claims, and something to really pay attention to. Again, speaking of brevity and trying to narrow in, there is in the COVID criminal enterprise all of the pieces, and we've identified sort of the spectrum, right? Starting from actually developing this disease through illegal gain of function research, to sending it out in the population, to where we are, the hospital homicide, and then into pressing into, and that's part of where the terrorism comes into play, the death tickers. Is that everybody remembers that, like on the media?
Oh yeah.
The homicide in the hospitals, and I know that's a serious charge, but that's what we're saying. That was also part of this design to scare people about the disease, and therefore push them into certain action. One action of which includes taking shots. It seems pretty clear. Right. And so this is, how insidious is that? They're getting paid. That's why it's a criminal enterprise, right? There's money coming in at every single level in order to effectuate this massive set of crimes. And the hospital homicides are part of that. If COVID had not actually killed enough people to scare people, well, we're going to press out the numbers from the hospitals. And we also know there's fraud involved in that. As many people that did die, we're talking tens of thousands of people all over the country, into the hundreds of thousands, I believe. As much as that's the case, there was also fraud about how many were passing. And then this issue of the traveling nurses and medical staff is to keep witnesses and also keeping people out of the rooms, the loved ones out of the rooms, and multiple purposes. One of which is to keep witnesses out of the way.
Yep.
And that's only one reason. There's a lot of other things there. But then you can start putting numbers up and you can manipulate things and you can manipulate death certificates, et cetera, et cetera. And there aren't enough easy controls on that.
Yeah. 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 I almost sucked in my breath when you said FEMA. What the, I mean, like you said, it's deeper than anybody really realizes. I mean, but it makes sense that it would have to be at that level. We're talking countrywide, countrywide across the country. So how do you coordinate that? I mean, they really did manage this like an incident. I don't know if you all are familiar with, fires and you have a whole incident team that shows up and they've already, they're already got their, it's a whole different set of folks that are normally there, but they really did sort of manage this as an incident type of management style, which that would totally make sense when you said I sucked in my breath, but at the same instant I went, wait a minute, that makes total sense.
But isn't it weird? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but when there is an incident, ordinarily, ostensibly, the federal folks that come in to assist are over and above. It's the idea of, well, the local population is swamped or resources have been destroyed as a result of the incident. So we're adding to. And what Mimi so accurately described is no, the need, the so-called dearth of personnel was created. Right. And then the narrative that this is an incident, so we're going to bring more resources in. No, you're replacing resources.
Right.
Which is, and adding more money to it. Just and I think one of the most it's really truly disgusting for me to see these hospitals now a couple of years out with these brand new several story buildings. And I know, and I don't mean to be salacious, I think this is true. They were built on the blood of people murdered at the hospital.
Right.
And the hospital administrations are proud of it. Oh, we're using all these resources to help our patients. No, it was a lot to hear the administration. You'll be proud of me, Chris. I did not take on my litigator hat and try to cross-examine the administration across the table from me because I was just there as a fact-finding mission. But it was extraordinary and grotesque, I have to say, to hear some of the things that they would say. Yeah. And also on the other end, try to argue that they're the experts and they should know these things and all the rest of us should listen. You can't possibly be an expert and at the same time claim we had no idea what was going on. It was unprecedented. Mistakes were made. It's one or the other. You take responsibility if you're the expert, no matter what the circumstances.
Yeah, they want their cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
If I could just throw a couple quick points building off of that. Let's also take a look at how many people died of COVID at home. Like, let's think about that.
Right.
None. No one was dying of COVID at home. They were only dying in the hospitals. That I think should be investigated.
Right.
And also when we're talking about like how coordinated this was, how FEMA was involved, USAID was involved, all of that. It's also important to look at the electronic health records. Systems like Epic, I know, is a big one that a lot of healthcare practitioners, even before COVID, would complain about, but that's the one where when you had someone come in shot in the head in like a gang fight, COVID, cause of death. And then the practitioners were actually not given training on how to fix that cause of death in many hospitals, or in some hospitals, their system wouldn't allow them to change it if there was a potential COVID diagnosis.
Wow.
So you had people dying of cancer, of gunshot wounds. They were being listed as COVID deaths. You also had a lot of problems with vaccine status. And so there were a lot of vaccinated individuals who died of either COVID or the hospital protocols or the vaccine or whatever.
Right.
in the hospitals, and they were listed as unvaccinated COVID deaths for those death toll tickers. And so it's like the electronic health records, those were a big part of it too. They were part of this coordination across multiple health systems.
Yeah.
And to that point, Chris, as you recall, some of the cases I was working on, I'm still representing one firefighter here in Orange County. My clients would tell me as they were doing calls to pick up people that they had to ask about the vaccination status because they ask all the diagnostics right up front. And they were being told at the hospitals not to list certain information about vaccines. So there was a lot. I know firsthand, I can't remember all the specifics, but there was fraud going on, and my clients were telling me that they saw it happen right in front of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's precisely what Mimi's saying. It's in order to provide this narrative about the lethality of COVID. And that we believe is demonstrating an intentional crime of terrorism.
Yeah. The gaslighting. I mean, it's disgusting.
You're right. Several years later, now we're being told, no, what you saw, you didn't see. And it's just so sad. I'm sorry. Your entire world went upside down.
Right.
And some of the victims, we haven't talked a lot about the horrific nature of these stories. And part of the reason we don't, when we're having a discussion that's a broader audience, is I think it's difficult enough to take what we're saying and take it to the implication, which is your government actively tried to kill you and got paid for it.
Right.
That's big enough. But when you start to look at the actual stories, people were being tortured.
Mm-hmm.
They were denied nutrition and fluids for days at a time.
Yeah.
In the cases where there was information coming out, either by phone, FaceTime or whatever, you have some really horrific things that you can see. And it's so clear that the treatment, meaning that the conduct towards the patients, was actually causing physical deterioration at an accelerated rate.
Yeah, a rapid rate.
Very rapid. And then you also saw, just recently, I saw a case where it was just extremely obvious to me. The family was not allowed to come in until that magic number of, 96 hours, Mimi? After the patient had been on the ventilator 96 hours, suddenly the family member was then called to come in. So they had to get the money, and then you can come in and see. And by then, the patient was more likely than not dying or didn't make it the 96 hours. So, these are the kinds of things that we believe, taken seriously by any law enforcement, they'll see the same thing we do, which is that this must be investigated. We're not demanding prosecution. We're arguing for investigation, see where it leads, but we're quite certain it's going to lead to prosecution.
Right. Yeah. And like I said, I don't think it's, salacious or hyperbolic either to say there was a bounty on our head. There was a bounty, and it was about $500,000 a person. I mean, that's what they ended up getting paid in the end. I mean,
follow the money, right?
Follow the money. It is. Yeah. And like you said, whenever you've got arbitrary numbers like that are consistent across whatever, what else are you supposed to think? I mean, again, the gaslighting, don't tell me I'm seeing, I'm not seeing what I'm seeing, that my eyes aren't seeing what they're seeing, that my ears aren't hearing what they're hearing. If you want to make me angry, that's the quickest way to do it anymore. Cause I just don't put up with it. It's just insane. So we're about out of time. That went quick. So what are the final thoughts? What would you like people to know, to take away, if you're going to activate folks, what would you like them to do in their respective states to help the cause?
Well, certainly, I want people to feel, you just spoke about gaslighting. And I think one of the number one things for us is, you're right. If this has happened to you or your loved one, what you saw happened. It's very important to validate what people saw and the extraordinary horror they went through. There's a lot of trauma now out there that is not seeing any relief, and that people are having a hard time getting closure on because it was so horrific. And now, accountability is slow, and those who should be held accountable are trying to say that nothing happened. So I just really want to make that message to people. I think also in terms of what to do, you can contact our office. We're happy to, as we mentioned in this interview, we're working on all the states. We also want to encourage people to know that you can do something. Just because you're one person doesn't mean you can't pray for justice. Do so with faith. God is coming. It's going to happen. Secondly, reach out to others who have been injured and are hurting. It's extraordinary what some of these family members have done in building these networks and just sharing with one another and encouraging one another. Also, support those in your community and your elected officials and anyone at the prosecutor's office who show an interest. If they want to do the right thing, help them to do that. Presume people are not going to be your enemy. Let's try to come together and push for this. And obviously, what we've been doing is just on behalf of the community because we think it's the right thing to do. We serve God and we serve the people. But if you want to give to the work that we've done, I think your show has that information. And we do take tax deductible donations through Former Feds Group. But I'll let Mimi share some other words. But that's I just want people to feel encouraged and not to give up.
That's a great message. Great message.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think now is a time to be hopeful because we're finally seeing investigators listen. We're finally seeing prosecutors listen. We're seeing our politicians start to acknowledge these truths that we've been shouting for years. So don't stop speaking the truth. Don't stop speaking up. And like Rachel said, pray because God has been through all of this with us. He's been guiding us and leading us. God is what brought Rachel and I together. These petitions were put together through a lot of prayer. And we're starting to see him move in really amazing ways. And it looks like we're starting to see more and more steps towards justice where, it won't just be God's justice, but he'll let us see a little bit of it too. Yeah. And so take heart. Now's the time to be courageous. Now's the time to be brave. Keep speaking the truth. Like Rachel said, reach out to your elected officials, your county DAs, your state attorney generals, your state and federal senators and congressmen. You're their constituent. It's their job to listen to you. It's their job to care about what's important to you. So let them know what's important.
Well, I think that's amazing words. And I think your point, Rachel, in terms of validating people, because what happened to so many happened so quickly and it was so traumatic. I think we are seeing like post-traumatic stress and types of things now. Yes. And they're wondering what the heck happened, and they are, being gaslit to think that it was them or it was nothing. So I think that's amazing. Right. Amazing words for folks. Absolutely. We're all about praying here and we're going to definitely pray for your efforts and hope that more states come on board and more investigations actually start happening. Like I said, I think once that dam gets poked, I think we're going to see a tsunami of information come out and of efforts come out. So awesome.
Well, and one last thing, Chris, what's important also, this is not political. I know there's political overtones, but this is about life and death and about people not wanting to see their loved ones killed for money. Yeah. This is something everybody can do the right thing about. So I think that's a really unifying point for any of these prosecutors in any of these states. Get out ahead of this. Let's do it.
Right. Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much, Mimi and Rachel. It's been a pleasure, and we'll have to have you on again as you get further in this process and follow along with what's happening. So, awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
See you, everybody.